Tumo type breathing, so rapid, and we look at this in the lab. We're actually running a human study on this now. So 25 or 30 deep breaths through the nose and out through the mouth, then exhaling the breath and holding, learning how to self-generate adrenaline. That's what you're doing when you're doing
some
that.
version of the Wim Hof technique, or
that's what that is.
Brian McKenzie talks about.
Right. An ice bath is doing the exact same thing. Stimulating adrenaline response. It actually improves the immune system. There's a published paper on this. Releases adrenaline, which buffers the immune system against infection. But getting good at taking yourself from low energy to higher energy. And then learning how to compress your focus. And I'll talk about the focus thing in a minute. Some people are so agitated, the monkey mind, they got too many things going on and they're thinking, okay, they're trying to sit down and write. I suffer from this. And I'm feeling like, wait, I've also got this person I need to connect with, and I'm kind of being drawn off course by not being able to put the blinders on. For people that have that issue, I think learning how to calm the nervous system is very powerful. And the best way that I know how to do that is based on 2 studies, one published in Nature, one published in Cell Reports recently, showing that physiological sighs, there's actually a thing in the literature called physiological sighs, are one of the fastest ways to bring our overall levels of autonomic arousal down. And a physiological sigh is 2 inhales followed by an extended exhale. So it's like, it's not just a deep breath, it's 2 inhales followed by an exhale, okay? And then what that does, and this has been shown several times now in humans and other species as well, is it dilates the little sacs of the lungs, and that second inhale dilates them a little bit more, and it pulls a little bit of carbon dioxide out of the bloodstream so that when we exhale, we offload the maximum amount of carbon dioxide, and it perfectly adjusts the ratio of carbon dioxide and oxygen in the bloodstream and lungs. And sometimes it only takes 1 of these double inhale exhales. Sometimes somebody needs to do 2 or 3. But that's the fastest way to bring the autonomic nervous system down. A lot of people need such a tool because I think we talk a lot about meditation and tools for calm, and I can go to Esalen for a weekend and get a massage. I'm going to feel very good, but then when I'm thrown back in real life, I need something that's going to work in real time, what I call a real-time tool. And most people don't know how to control their autonomic nervous system because it's complicated. I can't control my liver function. I can eat, that will calm me, but that has complicated, issues with it too if I'm just eating to calm myself. So the diaphragm is the one skeletal muscle organ that was internally, right? We've got obviously skeletal muscles designed to move things. It's a skeletal muscle organ, unlike the spleen, the liver, the heart, et cetera. It was designed to be moved voluntarily. And these physiological sighs are actually occurring fairly regularly during sleep to adjust our levels of carbon dioxide and oxygen. And there's a recent study showing that in claustrophobia, this is the breathing pattern that people default to try and offload that carbon dioxide. So whereas there are a lot of really interesting breathing techniques, Wim Hof, Brian McKenzie does great work, Patrick McEwen, the Laird and Gabby, the tons of people doing really interesting things out there. My lab has been focused on what are the neural circuits that are designed to achieve particular states that happen to impinge on and capture diaphragm function. And so the reason I think breathing is so powerful is that everyone has a diaphragm, and it's the immediate link to the body. A lot's been made of the vagus nerve. The vagus is the path between the body and mind, but the vagus is very slow. The vagus nerve calming is what you experience when you eat a really rich, carbohydrate-rich meal, or you've had a long day and you put your feet up and you're finally relaxing. It takes minutes to hours to kick in. Whereas the diaphragm is real-time control over your brain state. So the brain knows what the body is doing by how fast the diaphragm is moving. It knows its overall activation state. So when you breathe quickly, those 25 or 30 breaths, the brain says, oh, I must be alert. I'm going to start secreting some noradrenaline. And when you breathe slowly, that level of noradrenaline drops down. So it sounds so simple, but I think it's only in the last 2 or 3 years that my lab and Mark Krasnow's lab at Stanford and other labs elsewhere in the world have started to identify the neurons in the brain that are linked to breathing and how those 2 things relate to one another. And I think everybody should have a kit of tools that they can use to bring themselves down and ramp themselves up. I'll just say one other thing about focus. So when we're in a high alert state, something very powerful happens that I think partially explains your ability now to drop into this book writing. when there's a certain amount of adrenaline in our system, our pupils dilate. Remember, the eyes are not connected to the brain. Our eyes are actually two pieces of central nervous system. They are two pieces of brain outside the skull that were designed to control our overall arousal state. And so we can talk about this as it relates to sleep and sleep quality, but when I bring up the level of adrenaline in my body through breathing, or let's say I see a troubling text, or let's just say I just use a very Goggins type approach and just figure out the most painful, inspiring for me reason to do it. You know, it sounds vague because obviously, David, I don't know what goes on in your head, but a tremendous respect for your ability to do this. But he just ratchets himself out of that ditch and puts himself in motion. The pupils dilate. And when that happens, our visual system actually enters something that's a little bit more like portrait mode on our phone. There's a process called accommodation, and your ability to focus on one thing visually actually becomes better, and your ability to see everything else blurs away. And that's the ability to just see that screen of text, or that if you work on pad and paper, to just see that pad and paper. And then as you start writing, what people don't realize is that mental focus follows visual focus. Now, in blind people, it's slightly different. It follows auditory focus. But in most people, your visual focus, as you bring that into really sharp relief, that image of your book, and you stare at it, you're gonna feel some agitation and your mind's gonna be jumping all over the place. But if you wait just a couple minutes, the rest of the world will disappear. I think this is sort of like the flow state people are looking for. But remember, the gate of entry is one of, you have to wade through some sewage before you can swim in clear water. Right. That's the way I always think about it. But the visual focus is what brings the rest of the brain into cognitive focus. And people in the martial arts understand this. You've probably experienced this running when you're feeling exhausted and you can just concentrate on one milestone and get there. You can almost bring that into, like, what you're doing is you're linking that to the dopamine circuitry. You're saying that thing is the milestone, not winning the race, not some other thing outside this immediate environment, that thing. And when you're able to start capturing these peripheral circuits, meaning the body, the diaphragm, the visual system, then you start getting past this whole idea of mindsets, and it really becomes about the body setting the mind. And this is where I think when you say action leads the rest, right? What you're saying is grounded in real neurobiological data.
There's also a shift in your perception of time when you're in that state. Suddenly your relationship with time becomes completely different.
So I'm
and
really
I don't
glad
know whether
that,
and I'm not like, it's easy to say it slows down or it speeds up. To me, it's neither. You're in this weird liminal state where it's almost like it doesn't exist. It's not a relevant vector in your emotional experience.
I'm really glad you brought this up, because one of my obsessions is time perception. And having spent the last 20 years or so studying the visual system, what you start to realize is that space, meaning physical space, not outer space, but physical space around you and your time perception are absolutely linked. And when our focus is very narrow, time starts to feel thin sliced. So you're right. It's not that it's going fast or slow. It's that you're perceiving more events per unit time. So it's like a metronome that's going faster. When our gaze is dilated, so when we're relaxed, there's actually what happens is the pupil kind of relaxes a bit. It doesn't always get bigger or smaller, but what happens is when we're relaxed, so if you view a horizon, for instance, or you go into what's called panoramic vision, so even though I'm looking at you right now, I can dilate my gaze without moving my head or eyes, so I can see the corners of the room and the ceiling. I can see myself in the environment. When we do that, our perception of time broadens and we feel like we have more time. And what we're doing when we do that focus versus defocus, as I call it, or focal vision versus panoramic vision, is you're toggling on and off the autonomic nervous system for alertness. You're turning on and off that norepinephrine circuit. And so it's conscious control over a brainstem circuit. And this is why I don't like the phrase autonomic, because that means automatic. It's a misnomer. The breathing, I can control my autonomic nervous system. I can breathe. I can control my autonomic nervous system. I can eat a big meal. I can control my autonomic nervous system. I can focus or defocus. And if you really look at the realm of high performance, what you start to realize is people who are very good at their respective sport or career or in the special operations community, what they do, are exceptionally good at turning on and off these systems. So they're highly functional at achieving their milestones, but they're not spending out extra energy. Because when you go into panoramic vision, you start to uncouple this space-time thing and you get some rest and relaxation. The way to think about this is, so we go back to duration, path, and outcome. That's the most stringent, high-focus regime for the brain. The way to get better at duration, path, and outcome is to engage in activities that are low duration, path, and outcome, where your brain is not in modes of analyzing duration, path, and outcome. What's the one phase of our life when we're not thinking about duration, path, and outcome at all? Sleep. And so the reason why you can pull somebody's mind apart, their ability to think rationally and analyze duration, path, and outcome by sleep depriving them, is because sleep, despite all its neurochemical complexity, is really when we restore our ability to analyze duration, path, and outcome. Now you think about buds and you go, no wonder they sleep deprive them. They're trying to figure out who has the ability to control these mechanisms and who doesn't. Most people fail. So when I think about how to recover, I actually don't think about recovery as its own thing. I think about recovery as giving buoyancy or improving my ability to focus. So sleep is a turning off of these brain circuits that are thinking about what's happening next. So some people experience challenges in falling asleep. They need to learn how to turn off thinking. And there's actually a way to do this. We're doing a study on this now. It relates to hypnosis that would be fun to talk about. And we can, if you like.
Yeah.
The other thing is that just merely going into panoramic vision, say between a meeting, instead of looking at your phone, more focal vision. You're working hard on your book. Maybe you walk to the kitchen, just 2 seconds of what I call deliberate decompression, where you just kind of let your mind go broader, will allow you to reset your focus much more intensely when you return to that book, as opposed to if you had looked at your phone or engaged even in some other kind of deep duration, path, outcome type function of the brain. So when you start thinking about meditation, it's also valuable because a lot of meditation involves focusing on your breath. I actually think a lot of people are spending out this ability. They're working too hard in the activities that are designed to reset them. So the two ways to reset yourself in wakefulness.
Being just very adamant about my meditation practice.
That's right.
Because it's a letting go. It's not we're so programmed to like force ourselves to do things or to like dive in with intentionality, but so much of this is more elusive than that.
I think that we can all do ourselves a great service and perform much better in what we're doing by taking little micro recoveries in the form of dilating our gaze in between meetings, just for a second. Viewing a horizon is the best way to do it because it naturally brings the eyes into defocus. We're doing this in VR because we can control the visual environment completely. When you go into this defocus mode, you turn off that brainstem circuit, you're conserving norepinephrine for your next bout of focus and activity. Otherwise, you're spending it. And the brain doesn't care how you spend it. Doesn't care if it's on Instagram, doesn't care if it's watching the news. But learning how to defocus and then refocus very quickly can get you through a race that you wouldn't otherwise have been able to get through. It saves you energy and it builds energy. The other thing is we talk a lot about sleep, and sleep is extremely important, but there are other modes and brain states that can allow you to recover. One of the ones that I'm a huge proponent of and that my lab has been studying and other labs are studying is what many people call yoga nidra, where I've
done yoga nidra a lot.
It's a wonderful practice, just lying down and focusing enough of your attention so that you don't fall asleep and enough of your attention on and moving it around so that you're not really concentrating on any one thing.
I fall asleep every time.
I do too. I do too. But what we know, so I fundamentally disagree respectfully though, with the idea that we can't recover sleep that we've lost. Because what are we really talking about there? For me, it's the ability to perform these duration path outcome analyses. So in my lab, we have people do a cognitive task, and then we place them into these very deep states of relaxation through things that are kind of like yoga nidra. And people can find yoga nidra scripts out there. They're everywhere on YouTube, elsewhere. Or we have them do a hypnosis script. Hypnosis is very similar. Deep relaxation, wandering sort of attention, fairly narrow context, but it brings the brain into these unique states where you're neither asleep nor awake. And for people that have trouble falling asleep or trouble relaxing themselves, these kinds of practices are extremely useful because they're really teaching you how to turn off those modes of focus. So, we live in a stressed society. Some people are stressed because they're overwhelmed, but other people are stressed because they just don't know how to turn off their brain and fall asleep. And so if you want to learn how to turn off your brain and fall asleep, these practices are immensely useful.
How do you practice hypnosis by yourself, though?
So there's some scripts. I would recommend people go to one of the scripts on YouTube, or there's some good ones. I've never met him. I don't have any relationship to him, but Michael Sealey, Sealey, Australian guy, has some really good hypnosis scripts.
And they're just audio programs?
Yeah, you just listen to them. And these,
and he's not going to make you walk off a cliff or anything.
No. So stage
Okay.
hypnosis is very different. So I have a very close collaboration with a guy named David Spiegel, who's in our psychiatry department at Stanford. We're now looking at how daily breathing exercises can impact people's sleep and levels of stress. He's done a lot of work on addiction and trauma and pain management through hypnosis. And most all of hypnosis that's clinical involves bringing one's state into one of deeper relaxation, not full sleep, and then thinking about some behavioral change that one wants to make. These are ancient practices, really, and I think that they were developed by people that understood that rewiring of the brain requires focus and deep rest. What's interesting about hypnosis is it brings those two things together at the same moment. So normally you'll work really hard on something, then you'll sleep, and that's when the plasticity occurs. But hypnosis likely accelerates that whole process by having people enter a state of deep relaxation and focus at the same time, and allows those circuits to reshape themselves. And there's some published data from David's lab to support that.
That's fascinating.
So I think these practices are really useful. And I think that if you want to get better at performing, everyone now knows, thanks to Matt Walker's book and others, like sleep more, sleep better. But what if you have trouble sleeping? Well, or falling asleep? Well, we want to define what that is. Some people have a hard time turning off their thoughts. It's really hard. Remember, you can't do it. What you can do is to learn to control that perceptual window and distribute it so that your sense of time starts to kind of drift off and you end up in sleep more easily. And it's a practice that most people find if they do it for 10 minutes a day or so, they start sleeping much better within a week or more, and sometimes more. Sometimes people need some other help, like not drinking caffeine late in the day, et cetera. But that brain state of no duration path and outcome analysis is going to be the most restorative, and you can get it in wakefulness too. So taking a walk where you're just letting your mind go is very powerful. And the other thing that's powerful is optic flow. So self-generated optic flow by walking, running, or cycling shifts the brain into a state of relaxation that's not seen when you're stationary. This is well described in the neuroscience literature. For some reason, it's not well described in the wellness literature, but it's a real thing. When you move through space, you're active, there's a natural calming of the brain circuits involved in threat and threat detection. This is the basis for EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. The lateralized eye movements they have people do in the clinic, that kind of goofy looking thing while they recount
I've heard
a
you
trauma.
talk about that to overcome fear and trauma.
That lowers stress, and the rationale is that by coupling a low stress state to the recall of the trauma, it's going to allow people to reshape their relationship to the trauma, to tolerate the discomfort. And EMDR, my clinical colleagues tell me, works best for fairly well-defined traumas. It's not going to be like my childhood or a whole series of events, but for single event traumas or a trauma that's repeated but of the same sort, it seems to work best. It's not going to work best to completely reshape all relationships to all traumas, but it does seem to be powerful for a certain set of people.
So basically an example would be if you got into a car accident and then you're afraid to get in a car or something like that, right? So you take this person and you submit them to this therapy where they move their eyes back and forth laterally, which seems absurd.
Seems goofy.
Right? And so this is supposed to help them get over their fear or their blockage?
Yeah, so my lab studies vision, and we study stress and states of mind. And people used to talk to me about EMDR and ask me about EMDR, and I was like, this is crazy. This
Sounds like a music genre.
This is absurd, right?
Or a drug.
Makes no sense. Why would moving the eyes from side to side have any impact on states of mind? That's ridiculous. But then what happened was in 2018, 2019, and 2020, 5 quality manuscripts came out in very good journals from groups that were studying eye movements, not studying stress or trauma, that found that these lateralized eye movements, not up and down, but lateralized eye movements, quiet the activity of the amygdala, the limbic structure in the brain that's primarily responsible for threat detection and stress. And I was like, oh my goodness, this thing might actually be real. Then I started to dig into the backstory of this. And there was a woman named Francine Shapiro who came up with this idea, actually walking behind Stanford in the Stanford Hills. She was a therapist, and she figured she had this idea based on the fact that she didn't feel as upset about certain things when she was walking, that this might be useful. And she was smart enough to know that these lateralized eye movements are what reflexively occur anytime we're in optic flow. We don't realize it because they're subconsciously generated and they're very subtle. But she realized she couldn't really take people walking on their therapy sessions. I suppose she could, but it's not really practical if it's raining, et cetera. So what she decided to do was to bring the eye movement component to the clinic and had them move their eyes from side to side while they would recount these traumas. And people experienced tremendous benefit. And in fact, now there's a lot of evidence to show that these lateralized eye movements really do quiet the stress of the nervous system and allow people to continue to move forward. This is probably all anchored. I go back to that story of that deer that needs something. And as it's feeling that agitation and gets up and starts moving, the movement feeds back onto the brain to quiet that stress and anxiety so it can be observant of its environment. And that panoramic mode is what we are in when we are in a position to be very situationally aware. When we're stressed, we're going to have soda straw view of the world.
Right, on one thing.
This relates directly to addiction because I've spent some time at addiction treatment clinics and talking to people in that community. And it's very clear that, of course, there are a huge number of factors that play into why people become addicted and relapse, et cetera. But if you can get at people's ability to control their anxiety and their feelings of peak states and happiness, you don't guarantee, but you help reinforce the possibility that they're going to get sober and stay sober. As an addict gets more tethered to the idea that some substance is the thing they need, the progressive narrowing of the things that bring them pleasure, and everything else kind of falls away like portrait mode on the phone, they're essentially in a state of high stress trying to meet that dopamine need all the time. And they don't see other possibilities. The reason I mention not just stress and treating stress to get out of addiction, but also pleasure is that we've also seen this. When do people relapse? When they're feeling really good. When they're feeling really lousy and stressed, and when they're feeling really good.
Yeah.
They've been sober for 5 years. We hear about this in the news, usually from celebrity examples. People have been doing great. All of a sudden, they're back in treatment. And you're like, what happened? Well, what happened was the dopamine circuit from other things, maybe a great life event or things are going well, or stress, the loss of a job, everything crashing, puts our visual system and the rest of our brain into a myopia. We literally become nearsighted, and the dopamine system says, that's the only thing that's gonna get me out of the mode that I'm in. They literally don't see the other possibilities. So some of the work that I'm starting to get involved in now is to try and inform the addiction treatment community, the trauma community, that there are ways to use action in the body to move people out of states of myopia, nearsightedness, and this is kind of a cognitive nearsightedness, and allow them to start parsing their time perception differently. It goes right back to time perception. When an addict needs something, their sense of time is fixed to the retrieval of that thing or the reaching that thing. And then when they can dilate their sense of time, they realize they have time for other options. But until you can dilate that, there's really no chance, frankly.
You can't find a way in.
You can't find a way. You can tell somebody you're going to lose your kids and they'll do it anyway. And that just tells us we need another route to it. And so one of the things I think is powerful is to think about how can we leverage the visual system? How can we leverage the diaphragm system? In the same way that you would tell somebody who's has cancer or needs a surgery of a certain sort, like we need to leverage certain technologies. Well, we need to leverage certain inborn technologies of respiration and vision to be able to access states of mind that will allow us to make better choices. For the addict in that really nearsighted view, fixated, there is no other choice. And I think those early years of skateboarding and being, feral, it showed me that the people I knew that became addicts, and frankly, I know some adults who have become addicts, even who have very quote unquote functional lives. It wasn't just them. Those people, we like to think they're making a bad choice, and they're making a bad decision. It's unclear to me whether or not they have a choice in those highly myopic states of mind. And so what we need to do is we need to dilate their perception of the world around them. We need to dilate their perception of time. They need to learn how to relax themselves so they can actually see other options. And it all relates to how the visual system and the breathing system relate to autonomic function. Addiction is the perfect sort of laboratory to do this, and it's so important, I think, because if it were simply the case that people just needed family support, and which they do, and they needed encouragement, and they need discouragement about making the wrong behaviors, then we wouldn't even be having this discussion.
It's so much more complicated than that.
It's so much more complicated.
The thing, I think all of those are really powerful tools and important things to look at. With respect to the addict mentality or that disposition, there has to be a level of self-awareness in that addict that the decision to pick up the drink or to use the drug begins so far in advance of the actual behavior. By the time they actually pick up that drink, there's no getting in the way of that. Like, that decision has so much momentum behind it that it's almost impossible to reverse. So a breathing technique or any technique at that juncture is unlikely to be successful. So it's about recognizing, when that state is starting to shift in that direction, whether it's days or hours or weeks before the behavior choice, to intervene at a place and time when you can actually have an impact.
I agree. I think that it's always an uphill battle with addiction, at least at first. But even, just given the numbers on relapse, I think what was it that someone once told me? I don't know if this is actually true, but for most people, but he said, a recovered addict told me, that every day he tells himself, no matter how far I drive, I'm always the same distance from the ditch. Yeah. The addiction community has
There's so many awesome.
There's so many great takeaways from it. Yeah. What's interesting is there's some verbiage around the yogic community that is very valuable. I can't recall it off the top of my head, but they talk about the great support that one can get from learning to access brain states of timelessness, sleep being very restorative, wakeful, deliberate disengagement being very restorative, maybe meditation, maybe through yoga nidra, maybe through simple, quick breathing techniques, but being able to dilate and contract one's sense of time and not being locked to one kind of space-time regime. The ability to recognize that I'm not seeing clearly, right? I see what I see, but I don't know what I don't see. The ability to introduce that understanding for somebody can be very powerful, and I think we need to give them tools that they can look to very quickly. I don't think we're ever going to have a treatment for addiction that's in the form of a pharmaceutical, like one pill. Because if you start tapping into the dopamine system itself, you start degrading other aspects of life. So I think one of the reasons why addiction treatment is so complicated is that you need many elements, but the elements that come from the person themselves are ultimately the most important ones, of course. And I think physiology and neuroscience does have some tools that can lend support to that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that every couple of years you see new science emerge on addiction, and there's some new protocol, and 12 steps constantly getting thrown under the bus, and 12 steps what got me sober, and I'm very rooted in that community. I remain open to other modalities and protocols, and super interested in seeing where all of this is going. But I think it is important to appreciate how complex it is. Like, there's a trauma element to it. There's a behavioral modification element to it. There's a emotional, like, how do you find a way to anchor this person to a life path that has meaning and purpose, and all of these things inform this complex soup that's going on in their head that's dictating whether they're going to pick up a drink or not.
Yeah, and and I love the neuroscience community. With it's been my family and home for many years now, and the people working on addiction are motivated from the right place, and they are working exceedingly hard. There are a lot of data now that show, for instance, there are complete genetic changes in the cells that can, and the pathways that control dopamine and reward, and that's all wonderful to understand. But meanwhile, I think there are enough tools out there that they need to be aggregated in a way that's structured and that addiction treatment communities can leverage. One of the things that would be of great use is the idea of a biomarker. So you described that, and it's really a beautiful example of how when some early on you might be able to intervene, but later it gets much harder. We need biomarkers that are going to tell us, for some people or their family, that somebody's at risk. The same way you have biomarkers.
Like some kind of Whoop device, right?
Well, I think it's going to come from once you know how well somebody is regulating their own autonomic nervous system, you can predict pretty well whether or not they're going to succeed or fail in making good decisions. And so I do think a Whoop type device or other sensor device could be tremendously beneficial in detecting and telling people whether or not they are veering off course.
Right.
And I think
it's getting very Minority Report, though.
It is. I mean, I think machines are going to help us make a lot of decisions that we're actually pretty poor at making. But the simplest of those that we might see in the next 2 or 3 years is saying, look, you've been working extremely hard on your book. You're doing very well, but you're going to need an extra hour of sleep. I mean, that's essentially what was doing for you. Or
in 12 hours, you're going to make a bad decision.
In 12 hours, you're going to make a bad decision. Or even cueing you or insert might in there, right? You might make a bad decision so that you're more aware and you're going to devote a little more mental energy to the kinds of decisions you're making. I think that I pull a lot of all-nighters, and I still do, unfortunately, in my career, writing grants and so forth. And I have this rule that I learned, my gosh, about 15 years ago, which is I don't trust any of my thinking that occurs between 3 a.m. and 7 a.m. if I've been up all night. I just don't trust it because I start to think the world's falling apart. I start thinking the word "the" is misspelled. I mean, I really know I'm sleep deprived when words like "the" look misspelled, and then I'm like, what's going on? That's that duration path outcome circuitry starting to fall apart. So I think that that's an extreme example, but I think that short of having people buffer their lives with tons of activities and perfect nutrition and perfect social interactions, people learning to control their autonomic nervous system, I think, is really the next step in our species' evolution. I really believe that what we are seeing now in the world is a call to arms, if you will, or a request from Mother Nature to have everybody learn how to control their autonomic nervous system a little bit better, or ideally a lot better.
Yeah, it's absolutely critical, I think. I mean, right now, irrespective of what's going on with the pandemic and the political climate and the protests and all the upheaval that we're seeing, as a culture, we're experiencing an extraordinary poverty of attention and focus. We're so distracted by our devices. We're more anxious and stressed and depressed than we ever have been before. This is not going in a good direction. And to the extent that we can commandeer a little bit more control over these things and understand that we have some level of agency and we can reverse this sort of automatic pattern that we're on of just scrolling endlessly and doing what we're doing that we know is not leading us in a good direction, is critical if we're going to find our way forward. And to speak a little bit to what's going on right now, I think, and it's related, and I'm interested in your thoughts on, the neuroscience that is, I think relevant to this, is that we've lost the ability to have civil discourse. There's a real breakdown in communication right now, culturally and socially, and it's fractured our society, and it's not good, right? So what is going on neurologically with human beings that are attaching themselves and so self-identifying with certain narratives that it's polarizing our population and preventing us from being able to just be together or united or agree upon what is true and what is not true and share a value system so that we can see our way through the challenges that we're facing right now, which many of which are an existential threat to the future of humanity and the planet.
It's a huge problem. You articulated it beautifully. And I think neuroscience can offer a couple insights into why it's happening and perhaps what we might do about it. So one of the scientific results that I'm very intrigued by is in the 1960s, a guy named Robert Heath recorded from the human brain. These are people, you couldn't do this experiment nowadays, but skull popped off. My neurosurgery friends tell me that's no big deal. Electrodes lowered deep into the brain, all over the brain, and people can stimulate wherever they want. And they just report what they're feeling. So they press one lever, they feel drunk. They press another lever, they feel happy. They press another lever, they feel sexually aroused. And they're reporting all this, right?
When was this done?
In the 1960s, early 1960s. Several times, actually, and published twice, essentially the same data, different populations in the journal Science, which is sort of our Super Bowl, Science and Nature, Cell. Those are the big ones, journals, that is. So the number one brain area that people want to stimulate, they finally hit this lever where they go, oh, I like that. And they just keep hitting that thing and hitting that thing and hitting that thing. Frustration and mild anger. And I saw that result.
That's the choice. I could be drunk, I could be happy, I'm gonna choose frustration and anger.
Exactly.
Wow.
What that told us is it's clearly tapped into the dopamine reward system. It feels like a hit of dopamine to them more than anything else. So we need to put that on the shelf and keep it visible as we kind of march into this a sort of answer to your question. The other thing is an understanding that, and there's some recent data on this that are really impressive, not from my lab, but from another lab, which is that beliefs and information that supports our prior beliefs also increases the activity of these reward systems. So the more I see stuff that verifies what I already think or feel, that they are bad and they are good, or that we are good and they are bad, the more dopamine and adrenaline is released into my system, which we now know from our discussion a few minutes ago, changes the way I view the world. It actually changes the way I view the world. It means that I'm gonna see certain things and not see others. And this also relates to the auditory system. I'm gonna hear certain things and not hear others. The things that verify my beliefs I'm gonna feel rewarded for. The things that are counter to my beliefs, I'm not gonna be as rewarded for. So we have all these barricades to empathy and to really listening and to really hearing what the other side is trying to say. And we have all these support networks in our body and our brain, which are building a bigger and bigger divide. Now that's all very depressing. So the question is, what's the boat that's gonna get us across that divide? And I believe, and I'm not just defaulting to this because it's what my lab works on, but I fundamentally believe that the boat that's gonna get us to the other side is our ability to control our internal state, to be able to ratchet down our level of autonomic arousal just enough so that I can dilate not just my vision of what's happening in my immediate environment, but I can dilate my cognition, my thinking, to the possibility that there may be a kernel of value in what somebody else is saying, even if it's about me and I don't like what I'm hearing. Now, as somebody who spent time in the addiction treatment community, you probably know this is a lot of what you get good at as you learn to move through something that to you feels very good. And you know all the reasons why it would probably be good to change it, but you know what? You don't want to because it feels so good. So we're talking about an addiction to entrenched thinking. We're talking about an addiction and neurochemical systems that support lack of change, my refusal to change, and stubbornness. And I actually think, just like for the treatment of addiction and trauma, the key is to get people to learn to tolerate progressively higher levels of stress and maintain dilation of sensory experience, of thought experience. We've got to create some small little portals through which information can come in. A lot's been made of mirror neurons. I hate to break it to the crowd, but the data in support of mirror neurons in humans is not that impressive. And now the mirror neuron people are going to come after me, but fine. There are circuits in the brain that control emotional contagion, and those are what's powerful. My ability to recruit you into stress is much more powerful than my ability to recruit you into empathy for something good. That's a well-established neurobiological fact.
Or empathy for someone's perspective that I'm fundamentally going to disagree with.
Right. So I think there are three gates to getting there. And by there, I think I'm referring vaguely to the idea that we need to increase our level of understanding, at least our level of discourse, so that we can really hear other people's ideas, even though we don't like the way it feels and we love the way that we feel. This is what that result said. We love the way we feel. We don't like the way other people feel. The first thing is to bring the level of urgency that we feel internally down. We need to learn to calm ourselves in order to really have the information start to come in. Now, the system right now and people out there, everyone's in a frenzy. And you can see it, the collective conscience is kind of losing its mind. It's kind of out of its mind. We need to learn how to turn off those amygdala circuits. So are we all gonna get together and do EMDR? Probably not. Are we all gonna get together and do breathing exercises? Probably not at scale. What we need to do is start to figure out how we can, I think, especially for the next generation of kids, how to teach them to regulate their nervous system so that they recognize that pulse of adrenaline as placing them in a compromised position. Like, we have to leverage the idea that being able to hear and listen hinges on the ability to be calm. So therefore, the ability to be calm is crucial to hearing and hearing and listening is crucial to our advancement as individuals and as groups. The problem is everyone's been trying to do this backwards. They've said we all have to get along, we have to cancel culture, we all have to, listen to one another. And I think, again, we have to start from the inside. We have to teach it physiologically. Now, I don't have a master plan on how to do that, but one of the reasons I'm here and one of the reasons I'm, teaching neuroscience on Instagram and not just in my laboratory is until we can learn to regulate the self, I don't think we're gonna get where we wanna go as a culture. I think it really does start with our own individual ability to do that. And so, David's a really good example, for instance, of somebody who learned how to deal with his own internal mess and build something beautiful out of that. And he continues to do that. And everyone's got to find that process for themselves. And whether or not you have a perfect family or whether or not you consider yourself the most inclusive and accepting person in the world or not, everyone needs to learn how to do that for themselves. And everyone thinks we do it pretty well, but I think it's clear that none of us do it well enough. So autonomic arousal, autonomic control, I think those are the entry points for addiction, for trauma, and for really empathic hearing and listening. And until we do that, I think our species is going to continue to go around this merry-go-round, where every 50 or 100 years we crash right up against the same general set of issues, only now social media has made it slightly more, a lot more complicated.
It's a little bit similar to what you were talking about in terms of the seeking external validation versus finding it within yourself. Like, essentially, the protocol, the prescription that you just gave has a strain of Buddhism in it, in the sense that the world's going to change when we change ourselves. Like, the best, most impactful way that you can make a difference for the world is to focus on being the best version of yourself. How can you comport yourself in a way that allows you to be more receptive and objective and empathetic and able to listen and hear? And I think that's true. It's 100% true. And then I think about the person losing their shit in, Target or whatever over the masks or whatever, insane video clip of the day I happen to see on social media. And I think we're doomed. Like, is this person going to do that? No, I can't control that. I can only control myself. And I worry that when the onus is on the individual to solve the problem, that that we're not going to find our way through it, right? Like, we obviously need organizational and